Imagine living in a world where taking a bath was not just unusual, it was feared. Where the scent of your body wasn't a social faux pas, it was a declaration of health, holiness, and sometimes even wealth. Picture a time when stepping into a tub could be considered more dangerous than stepping into a battlefield. This wasn't the plot of a dark comedy or bizarre historical fiction. This was daily life in medieval Europe, a world where dirt wasn't the enemy, it was protection. To truly grasp the mindset of the Middle Ages, you must first let go of everything you know about cleanliness. Today, we associate washing with hygiene, health, and self-respect. Back then, water was not a symbol of purity. It was a carrier of disease. People didn't just avoid bathing out of laziness or lack of access. They believed, deeply and religiously, that too much exposure to water could open the pores, making the body vulnerable to evil miasmas and poisonous airs. By the way, where are you watching this from? What time is it right now in your country? Drop it in the comments below. And if you love learning historical curiosities like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. There's so much more coming. There are records of nobles, bishops, and even kings who went for years, decades, without a single bath. Queen Isabella of Castile was famously proud of having bathed only twice in her life, once at birth and once before her wedding. And she wasn't seen as eccentric or dirty, she was seen as devout. In fact, avoiding water was often an act of religious virtue. To smell of sweat, to wear soiled garments, to be covered in the dust of labor or pilgrimage, these were not signs of shame. They were proof of discipline, humility, and closeness to God. But what did people do when they truly had to wash? First, they hesitated. Baths, when taken, were often dry baths, rubbing the skin with linen cloths or herbs to remove the outermost grime without fully wetting the body. When full immersion was necessary, it was done quickly and cautiously. Doctors and religious leaders alike warned of the dangers of softening the flesh with hot water. It could weaken the spirit. It could attract sin. It could literally make you sick. This belief wasn't just superstition. It was endorsed by medical theories of the time, particularly the humoral system that dominated medieval health thinking. According to that system, the body was governed by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Balance was everything. And water, warm and invasive, could disturb that balance catastrophically. Public bathhouses did exist in many medieval cities, remnants of Roman traditions, but even these places became controversial. In some towns, they doubled as brothels, leading the church to condemn them as dens of sin. By the late Middle Ages, many bathhouses were shut down entirely, not just for moral reasons, but out of fear of plague. During outbreaks of the Black Death, which claimed millions of lives across Europe, people believed that bathing actually increased the risk of infection. The logic? Clean skin with open pores made it easier for bad air to invade. Better to be caked in sweat and dirt than risk the invisible poison that floated through the streets. Even children were not spared from this mindset. Infants were rarely bathed after birth, and certainly not on a regular basis. It was common for mothers to rub their babies with oils or ashes instead. Clothes were seldom washed. They were aired out or perfumed, but soaking them too often was thought to damage the fabric and the person inside it. The cold was a deadly threat, and wet clothing could bring pneumonia, consumption, or worse. In a world without antibiotics, fear of illness shaped every daily decision, and water, for all its cleansing powers, was seen as a silent killer. Those who did bathe frequently were often foreigners. Travelers from the Islamic world, for example, were shocked at how little Europeans washed. Muslim cultures at the time placed a strong emphasis on ritual and physical cleanliness. Bathing was not only common, but mandatory before prayer. One account from an Arab traveler in the 12th century describes Europeans as the dirtiest people God ever created. Yet even with this outside perspective, Europe remained mostly unbothered. To them, dirt was armor, not shame. And so, hygiene became something deeply symbolic. A peasant farmer covered in mud could be seen as more virtuous than a perfumed noble. A monk who had not washed in 10 years could be revered as a saint. Smell became irrelevant, or rather it took on a spiritual dimension. If you stank, you were human. If you smelled like flowers, you were probably hiding something. In this world, to smell was to live honestly. Of course, this didn't mean people enjoyed the stench. There were always efforts to mask it. People wore sachets of herbs or dried flowers around their necks. They chewed strong spices to improve their breath. They burned incense in churches and homes, not only to honor God, but to mask the overwhelming odor of daily life. But these were not acts of cleansing. They were camouflage. The filth remained, and with it, a sense of identity. One of the most fascinating aspects of medieval hygiene was its link to morality. To be clean was to flirt with vanity. To be dirty was to embrace humility. The church reinforced this constantly. Saints were celebrated for their rejection of bodily comfort. Stories circulated of holy men and women whose skin peeled from years of grime, who developed lice infestations as a form of spiritual trial, who reeked so strongly that it was said demons fled from their presence. In a paradoxical way, the worse you smelled, the closer you might be to heaven. But not everyone could endure this ascetic lifestyle. The wealthy elite, despite their declarations of piety, often indulged in private baths, scented oils, and imported perfumes. Castles and manors had hidden washrooms, separate from the public eye. These were not advertised, but they existed. The hypocrisy was real, and it was pungent. While the poor suffered through winters without so much as a damp rag to wipe their faces, the rich quietly soaked in heated tubs carved from marble, sipping spiced wine and breathing in lavender steam. Still, even the nobility feared being seen as too clean. So these luxuries were veiled in secrecy, justified as medical necessity or indulgences of the flesh that would later be atoned for. It was a delicate balance between survival, status, and salvation. One wrong scent and your reputation could suffer. Too fragrant, and people might whisper of vanity. Too sour, and they might suspect you of disease or worse, demonic possession. This strange equilibrium between fear, faith, and function created a society where dirt wasn't just tolerated. It was meaningful. Every crusted elbow, every sweat-stiffened tunic, every rancid breath told a story not just of poverty or ignorance, but of survival, belief, and resistance against unseen dangers. Cleanliness in this world was not next to godliness, it was next to madness. And yet, in the shadow of this dusty mindset, another danger was growing, something that didn't care about spiritual cleanliness or herbal satchels, something that would bring medieval hygiene practices to their breaking point and force societies to confront the terrifying consequences of their choices. If water was already treated with suspicion in the Middle Ages, then soap was practically an alien substance. To call it a luxury is generous. For most people, it was a myth, a whispered idea from distant lands or distant classes. Soap, when it did exist, was harsh, foul-smelling, and reserved for the very few who could afford or access it. But in a time when even basic bathing was rare and often feared, the idea of lathering oneself up in a scented froth was more likely to provoke confusion than interest. Medieval soap wasn't the gentle, sweet-smelling bar we imagine today. It was often made from a mixture of animal fat, ashes, and sometimes lime. This was lye soap, caustic, and it could burn the skin if not made correctly, and it wasn't made in local households, not regularly. Soap production was a craft limited to specific regions, and many formulas were closely guarded. In cities like Marseille or Naples, soap makers became known for their harsh but effective blocks of cleaning power. Still, even there, it was more of an export than a household staple. Most common folk had never touched it. When soap was used, it was often for clothing or utensils, not the body. People rubbed their garments on stones near rivers or soaked them in lye solutions to strip out grease and filth. But even this came with dangers. Lye could damage the fabric, irritate the skin, or trigger coughing fits from the fumes. And for the vast majority of peasants, the idea of soaking linens or garments regularly was absurd. They wore clothes until they were stiff with sweat, mud, and skin oils. Only then, perhaps during a festival or religious celebration where they cleaned, usually by boiling, not scrubbing. Even access to water itself was an uphill battle. Clean water was a miracle. Wells were few and often shared by entire villages. Rivers doubled as bath stations, laundry zones, animal watering holes, and waste disposal channels. A single stream might carry the runoff from a slaughterhouse and the rinse water from someone's dishes, and yet people drank from it. They had little choice. The concept of pollution as we know it did not exist. They didn't understand bacteria, but they feared bad air and the mysterious properties of foul smells. So they held their breath, made the sign of the cross, and hoped for the best. The few places where cleaner water was accessible, monasteries for example, became pockets of privilege. Monks often had systems to filter or redirect water using rudimentary aqueducts or piping. They were among the few in society who bathed with some frequency. Although, even then, cleanliness was often more symbolic than physical. Washing hands before prayer or meals was encouraged as an act of humility and respect, but full-body bathing remained suspect. Interestingly, the scarcity of soap and clean water led to a deep reliance on alternatives, many of which sound bizarre today. People would rub their bodies with coarse cloths, scrape their skin with dried corn husks or twigs, or cover unpleasant smells with layers of scented powders. One strange but common method was rubbing the skin with vinegar, which was believed to repel illness and close the pores against miasmas. Others used mixtures of herbs like rosemary, thyme, or sage to scrub their skin, hoping the strong scent would overpower the natural one. For the wealthy, imported perfumes and oils became status symbols. Frankincense, myrrh, rosewater, and ambergris were used to cover up what bathing did not fix. Ambergris, notably, was a waxy substance found in the intestines of sperm whales. It smelled sweet and earthy, and it was worth more than gold in some circles. Nobles would dab it behind their ears or on their collars, but even this was not a daily ritual. It was reserved for court appearances, feasts, or holy days. The rest of the time, they stank like everyone else, just more discreetly. There were attempts to introduce more regular cleansing habits. Some physicians and religious figures, particularly those influenced by Islamic medicine, promoted washing the hands and face regularly. The famed Persian polymath Avicenna's Canon of Medicine was translated into Latin and widely read in Europe by the 12th century. It advocated for hygiene, moderation in diet, and balance of the body's fluids. But while these ideas penetrated the intellectual circles, they rarely made their way into the daily lives of the masses. Among those masses, superstition ruled. If someone began to feel ill after washing themselves, the connection was clear. The water was to blame. There are documented cases of entire towns turning against wells or fountains believed to be cursed after multiple people died of disease. They would fill the well with stones, bury it, and declare the area forbidden. In some cases, entire communities reverted to collecting rainwater only or relying on wine or ale for hydration. Fermented liquids, after all, were safer than stagnant water, even if no one understood exactly why. Clothing, too, played a role in how people coped with the absence of proper hygiene. Layers were seen not just as a fashion or seasonal necessity, but as protection. Wool, linen, and fur absorbed sweat and odor, keeping it trapped and away from the skin. In colder regions, people might go months without removing their underlayers. When they finally did, the fabric could stand on its own. But this wasn't viewed as shocking. It was expected. Washing clothes was laborious, risky in winter, and seen as something you did only when there was no other choice. In urban settings, things became even more complicated. Crowded cities meant shared wells, fewer latrines, and more human waste on the streets. In Paris or London, it wasn't unusual to see chamber pots being emptied from upper-story windows with barely a shout of warning. Alleyways ran thick with excrement, animal remains, and rotting produce. When rain came, it didn't clean. It stirred everything into a nauseating slurry that clung to boots, wagon wheels, and the hems of cloaks. To deal with the smell, towns introduced regulations that few followed. Butchers were ordered to dispose of offal outside city walls. Tanneries were relegated to the outskirts. Certain trades, like dyeing or soap making, were considered so foul that their practitioners were legally required to live in specific quarters far from others. Still, wind and water carried the stench everywhere. The medieval city didn't breathe, it reeked. And yet, despite all of this, people adjusted. They grew up in it, lived through it, and carried on. To them, it was not filth. It was life. Their bodies adapted. Their noses dulled. Their expectations shifted. Clean was not the absence of odor. It was the presence of strength, the endurance to wake each day, wear the same clothes, drink from the same stream, and keep going. This wasn't just routine. It was resilience. Dirt, stink, and scarcity weren't problems to solve. They were part of the human condition. But the illusion of safety wrapped in grime was fragile. The more people shared contaminated water, the more they clustered in filth-filled cities, the more their outdated hygiene practices collided with the brutal reality of infectious disease. The stench of survival was slowly giving way to something more sinister, something invisible, something that wouldn't be stopped by layers of fabric or sprigs of rosemary. In a world where bathing was feared and soap was rare, one might wonder, what about the mouth? Surely people cared at least a little about their breath, their teeth, their smiles. But the truth is, oral hygiene in the Middle Ages was more of a hopeful ritual than an effective practice. And when it was practiced at all, it often relied more on superstition and trial and error than science or structure. To be fair, medieval people were not entirely unaware of their teeth. They knew pain. They knew rot. They knew the terrible consequences of a bad molar left unchecked. A toothache could mean sleepless nights, inability to eat, or worse, infection and death. There were no antibiotics, no root canals, and certainly no dental insurance. If a tooth went bad, the solution was often brutal. Pull it if you dared. And pray it didn't take your jaw with it. But even with all these risks, daily dental care was rudimentary at best. Most people didn't own toothbrushes. Instead, they used whatever was at hand: twigs, cloth, feathers, or even their fingers. The concept of brushing was more about rubbing or scraping the teeth in the hope that food particles would come off. Chewing sticks made from aromatic trees like neem, olive, or birch were sometimes used, not just to clean, but to freshen the breath. These natural brushes had antibacterial properties. Though no one back then would have known it, they just knew it worked. Now tell us, where in the world are you watching from? What time is it where you are right now? Type it in the comments. We love seeing how far our videos are reaching. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time to join the community. As for toothpaste, forget the minty paste we know today. Medieval mouth-cleansing powders were often made of crushed charcoal, ground bones, ashes, or salt. Some recipes included herbs like sage or rosemary, which gave a pleasant taste but little real benefit. Others added vinegar or honey to bind the mixture, and still others, especially among the upper classes, experimented with more exotic concoctions: crushed pearls, burnt bread, even powdered brick. There are records of medieval texts offering recipes for dental powders. One 14th century manuscript advised mixing burnt rosemary and alum with salt and using it before the rising sun. Oh, Another advised brushing with the ashes of burnt mice to combat tooth decay, a suggestion both horrifying and revealing of how far people were willing to go in pursuit of relief. For the devout, oral hygiene had another layer, spiritual cleanliness. It was not uncommon to believe that bad breath could reflect sin. A foul mouth, in the metaphorical and literal sense, might suggest a corrupt soul. Priests sometimes recommended confession as a way to purify the breath. Not medically, of course, but morally. Words themselves were seen as powerful, and the mouth was viewed as a gateway between the physical and the spiritual. If you spoke lies, if you gossiped, if you cursed, your breath might reek with judgment. This wasn't just religious poetry, it shaped behavior. Some monks reportedly chewed on bitter herbs as both penance and breath control, not because it freshened their mouths, but because the bitterness reminded them of the bitterness of sin. The mouth was both a tool and a temptation, and keeping it clean required vigilance of both body and spirit. For those with the means, more cosmetic efforts were made. Nobles and merchants who had access to imported spices and herbs often used clove, cinnamon, or fennel to mask halitosis. Some carried small metal or wooden sticks, early forms of toothpicks, which they used after meals to remove food debris. But these items were status symbols as much as hygiene tools. To be seen picking your teeth with silver after a feast was a sign of refinement, not necessarily effectiveness. There were also rudimentary attempts at dental surgery. Traveling tooth pullers and barber surgeons offered extractions for a price or a favor. They would set up in markets or public squares, performing loud and painful procedures with crude iron tools. A popular technique involved tying a string around the bad tooth, attaching it to a door, and slamming it shut. In some cases, heated pliers were used, both to grip and to cauterize the wound instantly. The screams were unforgettable, but if the procedure was successful, it might mean survival. If not, it could mean days of agony and possible death from sepsis. These dentists were rarely trained, and many were frauds, but people lined up anyway, because the pain of a decaying tooth, left untreated, was worse than the risk of the cure. In some towns, festivals included tooth-pulling demonstrations, part entertainment, part desperation. The crowd would cheer as a rotting molar flew into the air. For a moment, pain became spectacle, and everyone watching felt a little bit grateful that it wasn't their turn, yet. Oddly, even amid all this suffering, people still valued a good smile. Not in the modern Hollywood sense, but in the sense that teeth were associated with health, youth, and vitality. Rotten or missing teeth meant more than discomfort. They meant poverty, poor fortune, or divine punishment. This is why some individuals, particularly in royal or noble circles, would go to great lengths to keep up appearances. Some used white powder to paint their teeth. Others blackened them deliberately to disguise decay. It was better to look like you had strange-colored teeth on purpose than to be seen as ill. And while most people accepted dental problems as inevitable, there were always those searching for a miracle. Folk remedies abounded. Some believed that wearing a wolf's tooth around the neck could prevent cavities. Others swore by rinsing the mouth with wine or reciting specific prayers while rubbing the gums with holy water. In regions where pagan traditions lingered, healers might chant over a tooth while burning herbs, calling on spirits to drive out the rot. Despite their limited understanding, people were incredibly resourceful. They observed, experimented, adapted. They may not have had microscopes or antiseptics, but they knew what hurt. They saw which remedies brought relief and which ones brought more pain. And they passed that knowledge down, generation after generation, building a fragmented but persistent tradition of oral care based on survival, ritual, and instinct. But instinct can only take you so far. When the plague returned, when bodies piled up, and when even the breath of a stranger could bring death, the limitations of medieval hygiene became impossible to ignore. People began to look not just at their bodies, but at their environments. If brushing with charcoal and praying for clean breath didn't protect you, then perhaps the danger wasn't just in your mouth, it was all around you, in the air, the streets, the water, the clothing. And so the story of cleanliness began to shift again, from the teeth inward, from the personal to the public. A new awareness was forming, not yet science, but the seeds of it. An understanding that filth was not just unpleasant, it was dangerous, and that behind every festering tooth, every foul breath, every ritual scraping with a twig, there might be something much darker lurking just beneath the surface. In a world already drowning in dirt, rotting teeth, and the stench of unwashed bodies, it was not the smell itself that disturbed medieval people most. It was what the smell meant. In the Middle Ages, odor was not just a byproduct of poor hygiene. It was a spiritual signal, a moral indicator, a whisper of divine judgment. A person's scent wasn't just offensive to the nose. It was believed to reveal the state of their soul. To modern minds, that sounds absurd. But for a medieval peasant, merchant, or priest, the logic was undeniable. Goodness, like cleanliness, had a scent. Holiness was sweet. Sin was sour. If you smelled foul, there must be something foul within you, and so a powerful association grew between physical stench and moral failure. The sinner reeked because sin itself had a smell. The virtuous may have been poor and unwashed, but their odor would somehow be different, less offensive, more honest, more human. Church teachings reinforced this idea constantly. Hell was described in sermons as a place of unbearable stench. The damned were said to emit an eternal odor of rot and sulfur. Saints, in contrast, were said to smell like roses even after death. This was not just poetic metaphor. It was a belief held so strongly that when someone died with a sweet fragrance around their body, it was often interpreted as divine approval, a sign of sainthood. Entire hagiographies were written about martyrs whose bodies emitted perfumes long after burial. These odors of sanctity were treasured signs that the soul had triumphed over the filth of the flesh. This belief affected how people treated their own bodies and how they judged others. It created a strange paradox. While physical hygiene was often neglected or feared, smell remained a critical tool for spiritual evaluation. You could be covered in dirt, and that was fine. But if you smelled wrong, it meant something was spiritually out of place. Not everyone could explain it, but everyone felt it. A whiff of something too sour, too strange, and people would begin to whisper. Smell even played a role in legal and social standing. Certain diseases, especially leprosy, were believed to produce an unmistakable odor. Leper colonies were isolated not just to prevent contagion, but to remove the offensive scent from society. In many cities, lepers had to carry bells or clappers and announce themselves from a distance. It was not just the sight of their disease that terrified others. It was the idea that their very presence polluted the air. The smell of the afflicted was, in some cases, enough to justify banishment or death. But lepers were only one part of a larger pattern. The streets themselves became maps of scent-based class systems. Wealthier areas were perfumed with incense, myrrh, or dried herbs burned in homes. Poorer districts reeked of offal, stagnant water, and the crowded press of humanity. And within this hierarchy, there was another layer, one governed by occupation. Tanners, butchers, dyers, and soap makers were all seen as necessary evils. Their work kept society running, but their smells made them social pariahs. In many towns, laws were written to keep these professions at the outskirts, downwind, out of sight and smell. Even inside the home, scent was managed with symbolic urgency. Herbs were hung over doorways to purify the air and ward off evil. Lavender, rosemary, and rue were common, not for their cleaning properties, but because they masked the scents believed to attract demons or sickness. People slept with sachets under their pillows, wore fragrant amulets around their necks, and even stuffed dried flowers inside their sleeves. This wasn't about personal freshness, it was spiritual armor. The church itself smelled of power and mystery. Incense was burned not only to sanctify the space, but to overwhelm the stench of the masses. Imagine stepping into a medieval cathedral after walking through the crowded streets of a plague-ridden town. The air inside thick with smoke, the aroma of frankincense clinging to your robe, offering momentary escape from the relentless stink outside. To many, that scent was synonymous with hope, salvation, and a world beyond this one. It was no accident. The church understood the power of smell and wielded it with precision. Meanwhile, the act of confession, meant to purify the soul, was sometimes linked to the idea of freshening the breath, though not literally. If you confessed your sins, if you cleansed your inner self, then perhaps your outer self would follow. Priests often described sin as rot, not just a stain on the soul, but a putrefaction, a decay. The language was intentional. It made sin feel physical. It made shame something you could smell. This fusion of odor and morality became so deep that even bodily functions were tied to divine judgment. Passing gas or belching in public could be interpreted as signs of gluttony or lack of self-control. Excessive sweating might suggest impurity or sloth. The smells of the body weren't just tolerated, they were monitored, interpreted, woven into the tapestry of religious life. Even death didn't escape the scrutiny. A rotting corpse without the proper fragrance was feared as a possible revenant, a restless spirit who had died unclean and might return to haunt the living. Among mystics and theologians, scent took on even stranger meaning. Some monks fasted not only to purify their souls, but to reduce the stench of the flesh. Others burned foul-smelling items during visions to test their own spiritual resilience. Could they endure the odor of hell and remain focused in prayer? Could they separate the earthly from the divine? For these ascetics, smell became a test, not of strength, but of faith. And while most people couldn't engage in such extreme rituals, they absorbed the message. Smell mattered, not just as a signal of disease or poverty, but as a reflection of who you were inside. Parents passed these ideas down to their children. Communities judged newcomers not just by dress or accent, but by scent, and with no scientific understanding of contagion or germs, it was odor that determined trust. If you smelled wrong, people kept their distance. If you smelled right, doors opened. This deeply ingrained belief system didn't fade quickly, even as medicine slowly evolved. Centuries later, even during the Enlightenment, doctors still spoke of foul humors and used perfumes in surgical rooms. It would take generations and devastating pandemics for people to begin separating scent from sin. For now, the medieval mind remained firmly anchored in the invisible messages carried by the nose. The nose, after all, was the gatekeeper, and through it passed not just air, but judgment. But judgment didn't only come from the church or the upper class. It came from the environment itself. The streets were speaking. The clothes were shouting. The walls, the floors, the very fabrics people wore, everything carried a scent. And with that scent came a warning. Because beneath the spiritual interpretations, beneath the religious poetry and the moralizing sermons, there was a truth no one could ignore for long. The stench of a society wasn't just symbolic, it was dangerous. And the very things people refused to clean were quietly plotting their revenge. The streets of a medieval city were not just passages between homes, markets, and churches. They were living, rotting veins through which the pulse of medieval life ran. Loud, dirty, chaotic, and dangerously unsanitary. While our modern world is built around systems of hygiene that we take for granted, sewer lines, waste collection, drainage, the medieval world had none of these. And as cities grew more crowded and trade more bustling, the very ground beneath people's feet turned against them. To begin understanding what daily life truly smelled like, you must picture the city not as a place, but as a breathing organism. An organism with no digestive tract, no sanitation system, and no concept of cleanliness beyond superstition and religious ritual. Waste, in all its forms, was ever present. Human excrement, animal carcasses, rotten food, stagnant water. It all mingled in a stew of infection and inevitability. To relieve yourself in a medieval city, you had a few options, none of them pleasant. If you were lucky enough to have access to a chamber pot, you could use it indoors. But then what? The answer was almost always the same. Toss it out the window, sometimes with a shouted warning, sometimes not. A common phrase in French cities like Paris was garde à l'eau, or watch out for the water. It was not water, it was waste. And if you weren't paying attention, it could land on your head. Streets were often sloped slightly toward central gutters, and these open channels became the city's default sewers. But they weren't flushed with fresh water. Rain was the only cleaner, and it came infrequently. Most days the gutters overflowed with filth. Animal blood from butcher stalls, guts and skin from tanners, food scraps from taverns, and feces from every class, and corn ran together in greasy rivers. The stench rose up like a curse, choking lungs and attracting clouds of flies. To make matters worse, animals roamed freely, dogs, pigs, goats, chickens, all living among the people. Pigs were especially notorious. They were scavengers, often rooting through the trash and human waste for food. In some cities, herds of pigs were employed unofficially as street cleaners. It sounds efficient, but it was lethal. In 1131, a pig in Paris ran loose and caused the death of King Philip's son when it knocked the boy off his horse. That tragedy led to laws banning pigs from the streets, but the law was hard to enforce. After all, pigs were cheap labor and no one else wanted to clean the streets. Public latrines existed, but they were rare, poorly maintained, and often placed directly over rivers or open pits. In places like London, these communal cesspits were occasionally cleaned out by gong farmers, men hired to dig and carry away the waste, usually under the cover of night. Gong farmers were social outcasts. Though their job was vital, they were paid well, but the health risks were immense. Exposure to toxic gases, infections, and collapsed cesspits made their lives short and miserable, but without them, the buildup of waste became catastrophic. And so, people adapted in strange and desperate ways. Some carried herbs under their noses to block the smell. Others avoided certain alleys entirely, knowing the air was thicker there. Market vendors doused their stalls with vinegar or perfumed water, not to clean, but to keep customers from gagging. The scent of rot was so persistent that medieval perfumers became essential in urban centers, not for fashion, but for survival. In wealthier homes, things were slightly better, but not by much. Castles and manors had guardrabes, vertical shafts that dropped waste down into pits or directly into moats. The smell could be unbearable, and these structures often bred disease. To make matters worse, waste collected at the base of the walls made a perfect breeding ground for rats, fleas, and the bacteria that would eventually bring Europe to its knees. Water, so central to modern sanitation, was part of the problem. Wells were easily contaminated, especially in densely packed neighborhoods where latrines sat too close to water sources. Some communities turned to beer or weak ale as their primary drink, not because they enjoyed the taste, but because fermentation killed some of the bacteria. Children drank it, pregnant women drank it, monks drank it. Water was for the desperate, or for washing when one dared. Even architecture betrayed the struggle against filth. Houses leaned inward over the streets, their upper floors nearly touching above the alleyways. This design was practical for space, but disastrous for cleanliness. Waste thrown from windows had nowhere to go but onto the walls and windows of neighbors below. During hot summers, the enclosed streets became ovens of decay, thick with the smell of human life lived too close together, with too little care for disposal. City officials did try to regulate the chaos. There were rules about where and when waste could be dumped, fines for letting pigs roam, penalties for failing to clean the front of your shop, but enforcement was inconsistent and often ignored. Corruption, poverty, and ignorance made regulation nearly impossible. People lived day by day, minute by minute, and if the street outside your home was ankle deep in sewage, you simply stepped over it and carried on. Amid all this, one seemingly minor object took on great importance: the spittoon. Known as the escarador in Spanish, or crachoir in French, these containers were placed in homes, churches, and public halls to catch the constant stream of spit and mucus expelled by people. Why so much spitting? In part, it was due to the polluted air and heavy smoking habits, but also many believed spitting was necessary to clear the body of bad humors or evil spirits. It was considered impolite to swallow phlegm. Better to spit, and better yet, to do it properly. In churches, especially during long sermons, worshippers would lean over and empty their mouths into communal basins. These spittoons were rarely cleaned. In fact, one study of cathedral maintenance records from 14th century England revealed that the same spittoons were used for years without sanitation. The air in these sacred spaces, filled with incense and prayer, was also thick with the sour stench of saliva. Everything in a medieval city reinforced a single message. Filth was everywhere, and you had to find ways to live with it. There was no escaping it, no rising above it. Not really. Even the wealthy had to walk the same streets, breathe the same foul air, dodge the same slops flung from above. The stink was a great equalizer. It didn't care about titles or crowns. It clung to everyone. But for the poor, it did more than cling. It consumed. In the tightly packed slums, disease ran rampant. Skin infections, respiratory illness, and parasites spread like wildfire. Entire families might live in one room, sleeping on straw soaked with urine, their clothes never washed, their bodies never scrubbed. And still, life went on. Children played in the gutters, merchants haggled over prices, lovers met in dark corners, all of it against a backdrop of unrelenting decay. And yet, this wasn't the end of the story. The streets may have been choked with filth, but there were signs, faint ones, that change was coming. That somewhere beneath the rot, a new idea was beginning to take root, not just about comfort or appearance, but about health, about cause and effect, about the invisible forces that made people sick and made cities dangerous. The great stink of medieval life would soon meet its match, not through prayer or perfume, but through a revolution in thinking that would begin with the very fabrics people wore against their skin. In the Middle Ages, laundry was not an act of routine hygiene. It was a gamble with death. To wash your clothes was to tempt fate, especially in the colder months, when damp fabric could cling to your skin like a curse and invite illnesses believed to be worse than filth itself. The act of laundering wasn't about cleanliness or comfort. It was a dangerous necessity that people avoided for as long as possible, and often, the longer they waited, the better. The logic of the time was rooted in the fear of bad airs and the vulnerability of the body. Dampness was thought to open the pores and allow disease to enter. A person in freshly washed, wet garments was considered exposed and fragile, their humors unbalanced and their defenses weakened. This belief was especially strong in the winter, when the cold and wet were seen as a double threat. Stories were passed down about those who dared to wash their linens and fell ill shortly after, struck down not by the dirt they shed, but by the invisible forces unleashed by water and cold. So instead of washing, people layered. Undergarments were worn until they stiffened with sweat, oils, and grime. Shirts and chemises acted like sponges, absorbing the filth of the body to protect the outer garments. This inner layer was rarely changed, and even less frequently cleaned. Instead, clothes were brushed, beaten, and aired out, hung on lines placed near fires or laid in the sun. The idea was not to remove the dirt, but to dry the fabric, chase away the smell, and make it bearable for one more week or month. Washing, when it did occur, was often communal and seasonal. In rural areas, entire villages might choose 1 or 2 days a year, the Great Wash, to bring their linens to the river. This wasn't a cheerful community event. It was labor-intensive, cold, and deeply unpleasant. Women, usually the ones tasked with this work, would drag heavy fabric to the water, soak it, beat it with paddles, and use lye or ash-based soaps if they had access. Then came the worst part, waiting for it to dry. In medieval Europe, drying clothes wasn't simply inconvenient, it could be fatal. If the sun was strong and the day dry, you were lucky. But if rain came or if winter frost set in, garments could remain damp for days. Wearing them meant risking chills, coughs, or pneumonia. And in a world without antibiotics, that often meant death. So people learned to accept the smell. They learned to tolerate the stains. The texture of dried sweat hardened into crusty ridges. It was safer that way. There was also the matter of status. Clean clothes were not always a sign of refinement. In many circles, they were seen as a sign of vanity, or worse, spiritual weakness. To appear freshly laundered too often might draw suspicion. Why were you so concerned with worldly appearances? What were you hiding? The pious wore the same robes for weeks, even months, often refusing to clean them at all. Dirt was worn like a badge of asceticism. The more layers of filth, the closer to God. Or so the thinking went. Monasteries are a prime example. In some religious orders, washing was viewed as a distraction from prayer. There are records of monks who wore the same robe until it fell apart, patching it over and over but never cleaning it. In one notable case from a Cistercian monastery in the 13th century, a monk was praised posthumously for having worn the same undergarments for over a year without a single wash. His self-denial was considered a mark of holiness, not madness. The contrast between social classes added yet another layer of complexity. The nobility, of course, had more options. Castles and estates had staff who could manage laundry in specially designated areas, still outdoors, still exposed to the elements, but with access to better tools and materials. Nobles wore finer fabrics, linen, silk, and wool, which absorbed odors differently and could be layered in ways that disguised their condition. They might change more frequently, but still avoided actual washing unless absolutely necessary. Perfumes, scented oils, and powdered starches were used to mask the truth. Beneath the surface, their garments were often just as grimy. Lice and fleas thrived in this ecosystem. Without regular washing of clothes or bedding, infestations were nearly universal. People scratched constantly. Special combs were made to deal with lice, and certain herbs, like wormwood and pennyroyal, were sewn into garments or kept in bedding to repel the parasites. But there was no winning the battle. Laundry was not just about appearance or smell. It was about survival in a world teeming with things that lived on your skin and your sheets and deep in the seams of your clothing. And yet, despite all this, clothing remained one of the clearest markers of identity. Peasants wore rough wool in natural shades, often homemade and never dyed. Merchants might afford brighter fabrics or stripes. Nobles displayed their wealth with elaborate patterns and embroidery, layers upon layers of status woven into their attire. But none of these garments were truly clean. Cleanliness, in the modern sense, simply didn't exist. The best anyone could hope for was to appear less filthy than the person next to them. In fact, appearance became its own language of hygiene. A shirt that looked white, even if it reeked, gave the illusion of purity. A robe that hung neatly, even if lice crawled beneath it, suggested order. Laundry became less about actual cleanliness and more about signaling virtue, signaling class, signaling control over one's chaotic environment. A tightly laced bodice, a freshly brushed cloak, a hat without visible grease stains. These were victories in a world where real washing was rare and risky. And of course, laundering bedding posed its own set of terrors. Mattresses, when they existed, were rarely washed. Most people slept on straw pallets or sacks stuffed with wool, moss, or rags. These were breeding grounds for mites and filth. The straw was sometimes replaced, but the sacks themselves went untouched. Blankets were heavy, often made of animal hides or thick wool, and cleaning them was nearly impossible. In the cold months, they absorbed sweat and oils, darkened with use, and grew heavier with grime. But they kept you warm, and that warmth could mean the difference between life and death. There were exceptions. Certain religious festivals or holy days encouraged symbolic purification, which included washing clothes and bodies alike. On these occasions, people made an effort, but even then it was more about spiritual renewal than health. Clean garments were donned for mass or confession, not for hygiene. And by the next day, they were already on their way back to the familiar, comforting embrace of filth. It's tempting to judge these practices with modern eyes, but that would miss the point. Medieval people were not ignorant. They were cautious. They were strategic. They lived in a world where water could kill, where fabric was precious, where illness struck without warning and often with fatal force. In that context, not washing your clothes was not just a choice, it was an act of defense. Against cold, against disease, against social suspicion. The dirt was armor, the smell was camouflage, but even armor wears thin. Even the most carefully layered garments couldn't hide what was brewing underneath, because beyond the fear of dampness, beyond the spiritual debates about vanity and virtue, there was a problem that no amount of avoiding laundry could stop. A problem that multiplied in silence, that crawled beneath the skin, that whispered in the ears of sleeping children. And for medieval society, this hidden invasion would soon force a reckoning that no brush, no perfume, and no amount of layered clothing could ever mask. In a time when filth was familiar, when washing was feared, and when odor was interpreted as moral evidence, it was only a matter of time before something unseen, something far deadlier, crept through the cracks. That something was disease. And when it arrived, silent, invisible, merciless, it exposed just how fragile the medieval world really was. The relationship between hygiene and health, once viewed as superstition or luxury, would be shattered by the cold reality of pandemics. Chief among them was the plague. The Black Death, which swept across Europe in waves beginning in the mid-14th century, was more than a catastrophe. It was a wake-up call. Killing an estimated 25 to 50 million people, the plague didn't just attack the body, it attacked the worldview. In towns where water was feared and laundry was rare, where streets ran with rot and clothing festered with lice, the disease found a perfect breeding ground. It spread with astonishing speed, by flea, by breath, by rat, by contact, and no amount of prayer, perfume, or fasting could stop it. People searched desperately for explanations. Was it punishment from God, a cosmic response to sin, or was it caused by the alignment of planets, as some astrologers claimed? The truth, that it was carried by infected fleas living on rats, was beyond the reach of medieval understanding. But instinct told people that their environment was somehow involved, that the very air they breathed was dangerous. The smells that once signified sin were now feared as carriers of death. In response, cities implemented desperate measures. Bonfires were lit in the streets to purify the air. Public officials ordered the burning of trash, the killing of stray animals, and the restriction of certain trades, especially butchers, tanners, and dyers, whose work produced the worst stenches. Perfumes were no longer a luxury. They became tools of survival. People carried pomanders, small perforated containers filled with herbs and spices, tied to belts or worn as necklaces, pressed to their noses when walking through crowds. Rosewater, vinegar, crushed cloves, and camphor were rubbed on the skin or soaked into handkerchiefs, not for beauty, but for protection. Even clothing reflected the fear. Doctors, particularly in later outbreaks, adopted the now iconic plague doctor costume. Long robes coated in wax, gloves, boots, and a beaked mask filled with strong-smelling herbs. The mask was more than a strange fashion choice. It was a primitive air filter designed to block the miasma, or bad air, thought to carry the disease. While ineffective against bacteria, it was a clear sign that people were starting to connect smell, environment, and sickness in ways that challenged centuries of belief. Monasteries, once considered havens of health and cleanliness, became hotspots for the spread of disease. The very piety that had protected them from bathing too often now left them vulnerable. Shared quarters, communal eating, and an avoidance of bodily hygiene allowed the plague to move swiftly through cloistered walls. Entire monastic communities were wiped out. The paradox was cruel. Those who had devoted their lives to purity and prayer were dying faster than anyone else. Among the poor, panic took a different shape. In the slums and villages, where people lived in filth by default, there was little that could be done. They couldn't afford herbs, couldn't flee to the countryside, couldn't quarantine. So they died in silence, in masses, in streets piled with bodies. In some cities, death carts made daily rounds, collecting the dead like trash. There weren't enough gravediggers. Corpses lay in homes for days. The smell of death wasn't just in the air. It was in the skin, the clothes, the breath of every survivor. And still, despite everything, hygiene practices changed little in the short term. Fear made people irrational. Some believed that bathing during a plague outbreak would open the pores and let the disease in. So they avoided water more than ever. Clothes went unwashed for even longer. Streets, too dangerous to clean, grew worse. The irony was grim. In their attempts to protect themselves, people clung tighter to the very habits that helped the disease flourish. But not everyone stood still. In some corners of Europe, the plague became a turning point. Public health measures, rudimentary though they were, began to take shape. Quarantines were introduced in port cities like Venice, where ships were required to wait 40 days, 40 giorni, before docking. The word quarantine was born. Lazarettos, or plague hospitals, were built on isolated islands. Governments hired inspectors to monitor waste and street conditions. The seeds of sanitation had been planted, not from logic, but from desperation. Meanwhile, spiritual responses shifted. Where once people had seen disease as a punishment from God, now they saw it as a test. Flagellants, groups of religious fanatics, marched from town to town, whipping themselves in public, begging for divine mercy. They believed their suffering would save humanity. Others turned to local saints, relics, or miracle cures. Snake oil merchants sold potions made from crushed emeralds, unicorn horn, which was actually narwhal tusk, or powdered mummy flesh, anything to offer hope. None of it worked, but it showed just how far people were willing to go to find meaning in their suffering. Among the most tragic consequences of the plague was its effect on community. Fear of contamination tore families apart. Mothers abandoned sick children. Neighbors locked their doors against each other. In some cases, the healthy threw the sick out into the streets to die alone. It wasn't cruelty, it was survival. But it left scars deeper than infection. The bonds that once held medieval society together, faith, family, routine, began to unravel. Yet even as the disease returned again and again in waves, there were survivors, and those survivors remembered. Slowly, painfully, lessons began to take hold. People began to clean more, not because they suddenly understood bacteria, but because they had seen what happened when they didn't. Cities invested in rudimentary sanitation crews. Waste disposal became more organized. Laws against dumping filth in public places were enforced with greater seriousness. The belief that smell was linked to sickness hadn't vanished, it had evolved. Now it was more than moral judgment, it was public health. Among physicians and scholars, new theories emerged. Some began to question the old humoral models. They studied contagion, observed patterns, noted how the disease spread faster in certain neighborhoods. They didn't yet know about microbes, but they knew that proximity, filth, and lack of airflow were part of the problem. They may not have had microscopes, but they had eyes, and what they saw changed everything. The aftermath of the plague reshaped Europe in more ways than one. Labor shortages gave peasants new power. Cities rebuilt with wider streets and better ventilation. Cleanliness, once dismissed as vanity or spiritual weakness, began to take on new meaning. Not overnight, and not universally, but the shift had begun. The fear of water remained, but it no longer outweighed the fear of death. And as people looked back on the plague years, one question echoed louder than the rest. What had they missed? What invisible force had slipped past their prayers, their incense, their layers of unwashed clothes and sacred relics? The answer wouldn't arrive for centuries, but its shadow was already growing. Because while the plague may have passed, a new age was coming, one where filth would no longer be a badge of piety, but a threat to civilization. And at the heart of that transformation was an unlikely battlefield, the human nose. In a world drenched in sweat, rot, and human waste, where water was feared and disease stalked every street corner, one sense became humanity's last desperate line of defense: smell. When nothing else seemed reliable, the nose became the judge of safety, health, and status. And in this olfactory battlefield, perfume and fragrance, no longer merely luxuries of the elite, transformed into weapons of survival, deception, and social warfare. The use of scents in the Middle Ages was more than a matter of vanity. It was an act of necessity. In crowded cities where latrines overflowed and chamber pots rained from windows, where animals defecated freely and corpses sometimes lay unattended, the air itself became a threat. People didn't understand bacteria, but they understood stench. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was terrifying. And in the absence of soap, plumbing, or widespread bathing, masking the odor became a cultural art. Enter the age of masking fragrances, powders, oils, balms, resins, and herbs that filled homes, bodies, and clothing with a different kind of protection. Not physical, but symbolic. If you couldn't clean your body, you could at least convince the world, and maybe yourself, that you weren't contaminated. The nobility led the charge. Their vast wardrobes included not only elaborate robes and tunics, but also intricately designed sachets sewn directly into their garments. These small pouches were filled with dried lavender, rosemary, sage, cloves, or musk. The fragrances weren't always pleasant by modern standards. Many were pungent, spicy, or bitter, but they served a purpose. They masked the real odor underneath. In wealthier courts, perfumes distilled from imported spices and rare ingredients like ambergris and civet were worn as status symbols, each drop more expensive than gold. Ambergris, one of the most prized scent ingredients, came from the digestive system of sperm whales. It was rare, mysterious, and intoxicating. Nobles would dab it on their clothes, place it inside scented beads, or burn it in censers. The scent was so distinct that it became associated with wealth and nobility itself. But it was more than fashion. In an age where plagues spread invisibly, people believed that sweet-smelling substances could protect them from foul air, and thus from disease. This belief had deep roots. Since ancient times, bad odors were associated with illness. The miasma theory, the idea that diseases were caused by bad air, dominated medieval medical thinking. So burning incense, carrying aromatic herbs, or wearing perfume wasn't superficial. It was strategic. It was a way to defend against death. In fact, entire homes were designed to accommodate this obsession with scent. In upper-class households, rushes and herbs were strewn across floors, not only to absorb dirt, but to perfume the air as people walked over them. These strewing herbs were refreshed regularly and included mint, thyme, basil, and marjoram. During feasts or holy days, floors might be layered with petals, spices, and crushed greenery so thick that the air pulsed with fragrance. It was overwhelming, but in a city that otherwise reeked of decay, it was intoxicating relief. Even furniture was scented. Carved wooden chests were lined with cedar or sandalwood, curtains were infused with rosewater, gloves, belts, and undergarments were rubbed with oils or stored in boxes of potpourri. The goal was not to erase filth, no one expected that, but to conquer it with an artificial veil. In public spaces, the need for olfactory defense was even more extreme. Churches, ironically filled with some of the most unwashed bodies in a community, burned incense not just for ritual sanctity, but for sanitation. The thick, cloying smoke of frankincense and myrrh wasn't just symbolic, it was practical. It dulled the smell of hundreds of bodies packed shoulder to shoulder, many of whom had not bathed in weeks or even months. Markets, taverns, and brothels used similar tactics. Vendors burned herbs in small pots. Innkeepers splashed vinegar on their floors to neutralize smells. Brothels, often accused of spreading disease, were ironically some of the most heavily perfumed places in medieval cities. Their owners understood that scent played a role in perception. If you could overpower the stench of the street, you could sell the illusion of safety, cleanliness, even luxury. The obsession with scent also created bizarre social rituals. In elite circles, it became fashionable to exchange scented gloves as gifts. These gloves, soaked in perfumed oils, were not only worn but sniffed theatrically in public as symbols of refinement. Perfume became part of courtship. A nobleman might send a scented letter to a lady. A woman might anoint her hair with rosewater before entering a gathering. Entire books were written detailing how to prepare the perfect perfumes, how to layer scents, how to time them for maximum effect. Yet beneath this fragrant facade, the truth remained. These smells didn't purify, they disguised. They didn't protect the body, they pacified the mind. The poor couldn't afford any of these luxuries. Their smells were raw, unfiltered, and constantly judged. To reek of sweat and waste was not just unfortunate, it was suspicious. You were labeled as diseased, dangerous, or morally corrupt. This divide deepened after the plague years. Scent became a form of class warfare. The wealthy masked themselves in floral illusions, while the poor were left to suffocate in the same air that had always killed them. And still, people clung to the fantasy. A well-placed pomander might not stop an infection, but it made you feel like you had some control over your invisible enemy. Interestingly, not all scented objects were portable. Some were built directly into architecture. In Venice, for example, perfumed water was poured into public fountains during festivals. In Paris, flower stalls were strategically placed near markets and butcher shops to mitigate the smell of blood and offal. Cities fought stench, not with soap, but with blossoms. But even the most fragrant flower couldn't compete with what lay underneath. The rot, the grime, the human toll of centuries without proper sanitation. And no matter how many cloves you chewed or how much cinnamon oil you wore, the truth lingered just beneath the surface. Smell might have tricked the senses, but it couldn't hide reality forever. Because eventually, scent stopped being enough. People began to notice that the perfume did not always survive. That those wrapped in rosewater still coughed blood. That incense could not prevent death, only hide its scent. And slowly, a shift began. A dangerous question started to form in the back of people's minds. What if the problem wasn't just the smell? What if the real danger wasn't the stench, but the source of it? And that question would lead them to a place they had long neglected. A place rarely touched by water or soap. A place of silence, of shame, of secrets, hidden beneath linen and wool. Because as people reached for flowers to mask their fear, something else was festering quietly, ignored for too long. Something uniquely human, unspoken, and far more revealing than even the most carefully chosen perfume. In the vast, pungent landscape of medieval hygiene, there was one subject so wrapped in taboo, shame, and misunderstanding that it was barely spoken of, yet impossible to ignore. It was a subject that shaped the daily lives of half the population, influenced medicine, morality, and even architecture, and yet remained cloaked in silence. That subject was women. More specifically, women's hygiene, and within it, one of the most misunderstood aspects of medieval life, menstruation. In a society where even basic hygiene was treated with suspicion, the realities of the female body were viewed with layers of fear, myth, and superstition. Menstruation was not seen as natural or healthy. It was seen as dangerous. Blood, especially menstrual blood, was considered impure, corrupting, and sometimes even demonic. It was believed to spoil wine, wilt crops, and curdle milk. According to some medieval medical texts, a menstruating woman could cause a mirror to tarnish or iron to rust simply by looking at it. These weren't fringe beliefs, they were widely accepted. Influential thinkers like Aristotle and Galen had written centuries earlier that women's bodies were colder, wetter, and more unstable than men's. Their ideas were absorbed into medieval theology and medicine, reinforcing the notion that women were physically and spiritually weaker, prone to hysteria, and forever in need of regulation and surveillance. The church doubled down, teaching that Eve's original sin tainted all women, and menstruation was a visible, monthly reminder of that curse. So what did a medieval woman do when her cycle arrived? The answer depends on her social status, her region, and how much pain she was willing to endure. There were no disposable pads, no modern tampons, no painkillers. Most women used folded rags, known as clouts, held in place with strips of linen tied around the waist and between the legs. These cloths had to be washed and reused, which meant dealing directly with the blood, a task often performed in secrecy. Many poor women had no access to rags at all and simply bled into their clothing or sitting surfaces, especially if they worked outdoors. Comfort was rare. In fact, during menstruation, women were often expected to stay silent, still, and isolated. In some areas, they were barred from entering churches or touching holy objects. Others were forced to announce their unclean status to avoid accidental contamination of food or people. Jewish and Christian laws alike often included rules about menstruating women, where they could sit, what they could touch, even what they were allowed to pray. Despite these restrictions, medieval women developed coping strategies. Herbal remedies were used to reduce pain, regulate cycles, or induce early periods if needed. Mugwort, pennyroyal, rue, and feverfew were common herbs taken as teas or tonics. Some worked, others were dangerous. Women passed these recipes down through generations, often in secret, away from male doctors and priests who considered the female body too unstable to treat with science. Among the upper classes, privacy allowed for slightly more dignity. Ladies might have designated rooms or servants to assist with their cycles. Bedding was changed more frequently. Linen undergarments could be customized for better support. But even noble women were not immune to pain, judgment, or danger. Menstruation could interfere with court appearances, religious duties, or travel. And when it did, it was usually blamed on the woman's weakness rather than the system's failure to accommodate her. Pregnancy didn't offer much relief. In many ways, it only complicated the situation. While pregnancy temporarily stopped menstruation, it brought new risks, especially in a world where childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women. The same taboos surrounding menstruation extended to childbirth, which was often treated as both a blessing and a punishment. Women gave birth at home, surrounded by midwives, without any medical sanitation, anesthetics, or understanding of infection. If a woman died in childbirth, it was often seen as divine will, or worse, as judgment for past sins. And after childbirth came another challenge, postpartum bleeding. Known as lochia, this discharge could last for weeks, and women had to manage it using the same cloth methods as menstruation. There were no postpartum pads, no antibiotics to prevent infection, and little rest. Many women were expected to resume household duties within days, bleeding silently as they carried buckets, baked bread, and tended to livestock. Beyond the physical burden, there was the emotional weight. Women were taught to be ashamed of their bodies, to hide their pain, and to accept their suffering as a spiritual duty. Pain was not a problem to be solved, it was a reminder of Eve. Many women internalized this. Others resisted in quiet ways. They formed tight-knit circles where knowledge was shared, where daughters learned from mothers and aunts, where community replaced understanding from the outside world. Menstrual blood itself was feared not just socially but physically. Some believed it could poison crops, blind animals, or render men impotent, yet paradoxically, there were also beliefs that it could be used medicinally. Some folk healers claimed menstrual blood could cure skin diseases or be used in love potions. These contradictory ideas, blood as both poison and cure, revealed just how little was understood and how deeply gendered the fear of filth had become. Clothing, once again, became both burden and disguise. Women often wore long skirts with multiple layers, partly for warmth, partly to absorb any leaks. Darker fabrics were preferred, not because of style, but because they hid stains. Some women carried extra cloths hidden in belts or sleeves. Others lined chairs with straw or moss when sitting for long periods. It was a life of constant preparation, of vigilance against embarrassment, of calculating each step in public against the risk of exposure. Bathing, already rare for everyone, was even more complicated for menstruating women. Some believed that washing during menstruation could cause blood to turn inward, leading to sickness or madness. Others believed it was necessary for spiritual purification, but risky to health. As a result, most women avoided bathing altogether during their cycles, relying instead on cloths, herbs, and the hope that no one would notice. Even silence was weaponized. There were few written records about menstruation from women themselves. Most of what we know comes from male doctors, priests, or chroniclers, men who didn't experience it and often described it with disgust or ridicule. The female experience remained hidden in footnotes, whispered between generations, left out of the grand narratives of castles, wars, and cathedrals. But within that silence, women survived. They adapted. They managed pain without medicine, bleeding without support, hygiene without resources. Their resilience was invisible but profound. Every month, they faced a reality the world refused to acknowledge and found ways to live through it anyway. And while society forced them to be discreet, the consequences of ignoring women's hygiene could not be hidden. Illness, infection, and death were constant reminders that the body could not be silenced. That beneath the perfume and the superstition, there was an urgent truth waiting to be acknowledged. Because while the medieval world judged women for bleeding, it did little to help them, and as that blood flowed, unseen, unmanaged, and unspoken, it told a story louder than any sermon or scroll. A story that exposed the limits of faith, the dangers of ignorance, and the urgent need for a new kind of cleanliness, one not rooted in shame or fear, but in care. And that need would soon reach even the most sacred corners of medieval life, where the battle between spiritual and physical cleanliness would collide head-on. In the medieval world, the body was not merely flesh, it was a vessel for the soul, a shell whose value was measured less by its cleanliness and more by its piety. Cleanliness, as we define it today, simply didn't exist. What mattered more was spiritual purity, and in this deeply religious society, that meant the soul had to be washed even if the body remained caked in filth. The belief that cleanliness is next to godliness would not emerge for centuries. In the Middle Ages, if anything, physical dirt was often seen as a mark of spiritual discipline. And that belief shaped everything. To understand how this idea permeated the medieval mind, you must enter the worldview of a devout peasant or monk in the 12th or 13th century. To suffer was to be holy. To deny the body was to uplift the spirit. And to scrub away too much comfort or vanity, including through bathing, grooming, or beautifying, was to resist the temptations of the flesh. In other words, the filthier you were, the closer you might be to heaven. This wasn't abstract theology, it was lived reality. Saints were praised not for their immaculate robes, but for their filthy garments and lice-infested skin. Stories of holy men and women abound, in which their spiritual greatness was directly linked to their rejection of bodily care. St. Francis of Assisi reportedly refused to wash because he believed cleanliness encouraged pride. St. Agnes was said to have worn the same dress for her entire life. Other ascetics were celebrated for living in caves, sleeping in rags, and never once bathing, even in old age. In monasteries, cleanliness was highly regulated, not in the way we might assume, but as part of the monastic timetable. Washing of the hands and face before prayer or meals was encouraged, but full bathing was rare and only permitted under strict circumstances. Some orders allowed bathing just twice a year, while others permitted it only when a monk was seriously ill. The body was considered a distraction. Its needs were to be minimized, controlled, and, if possible, ignored entirely. The strict spiritual discipline extended even to the dying. On their deathbeds, many holy individuals refused to be washed or clothed in clean linen, believing that their suffering and decay were signs of their passage into divine grace. Some even requested that their lice be left undisturbed, as the tiny creatures were sharing in their penance. The idea of spiritual hygiene took precedence over every bodily function. Confession, fasting, and prayer were seen as more important than any physical cleansing. A man could be covered in dirt, lice, and open sores, but if he had confessed his sins and lived a devout life, he was considered clean in the only way that mattered. Conversely, someone who bathed frequently, wore perfume, or showed concern for appearance might be viewed with suspicion as vain, worldly, or morally weak. This wasn't limited to monastics. Among lay people, especially the poor, physical cleanliness was often inaccessible, but also unnecessary in the eyes of their faith. A shepherd might go weeks without washing, sleep beside animals, wear the same tunic through every season, and still believe himself pure, because he attended Mass, gave alms, and kept the commandments. Holiness was not about smell or skin, it was about obedience and faith. Even architecture reflected this hierarchy of purity. Churches were designed to cleanse the soul, not the body. Holy water fonts at entrances reminded worshippers of baptism, the one true cleansing that was deemed essential for salvation. The waters of baptism washed away original sin, and once done, needed no physical repetition. In this view, the soul was eternally clean, no matter how dirty the hands that folded in prayer. But this separation between spiritual and physical cleanliness was not without tension. The contradiction became increasingly difficult to ignore as the centuries wore on and disease outbreaks became more frequent and deadly. The plague, leprosy, and chronic infections forced people to confront the reality that bodies mattered, that filth could kill no matter how devout the heart. And in that realization, a quiet shift began. Some theologians began to suggest that caring for the body could itself be a holy act, that God, who created flesh as well as spirit, did not intend for one to be neglected at the expense of the other. The writings of figures like Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess and mystic, began to bridge the gap. She wrote extensively on herbs, diet, and natural remedies, blending faith with bodily care. Her works suggested that cleanliness of the body could support spiritual clarity rather than undermine it. Hospitals run by religious orders began to appear throughout Europe. Not modern hospitals, but places where monks and nuns tended to the sick, often washing them and cleaning wounds. The act of bathing the ill became a form of charity, a way to serve Christ by serving others. The idea that physical care could be an extension of divine love took root, quietly challenging centuries of ascetic filth. Even so, these ideas were slow to spread. For most medieval people, the body remained suspect, especially the female body, and cleanliness remained tied to fear, of vanity, of temptation, of losing one's soul to superficiality. It wasn't until the Renaissance and the Enlightenment that cleanliness would be reframed as a public good, a civic duty, and a sign of education and virtue. Only then would the phrase, cleanliness is next to godliness, begin to gain popularity, not in scripture, but in moral instruction books and household manuals. But in the world of the Middle Ages, the tension between dirt and divinity lingered in every crack and corner. A monk's robe, stained with years of sweat, was a badge of holiness. A woman's unwashed hands after childbirth were not a concern. A peasant child, covered in muck, saying his prayers in a smoky wooden chapel, was just as clean as any nobleman in perfumed furs, maybe even more so. It is this paradox that makes medieval hygiene so fascinating. It wasn't just about filth, it was about belief, about how people made sense of their suffering, about how they measured worth, not in freshness or fragrance, but in devotion. Dirt was not always neglect. Sometimes it was conviction, sometimes it was strength. And so, in that strange and distant world where water was feared and soap was scarce, people did not think of hygiene as we do. They saw it through a different lens, a lens of eternity. And while that lens may seem fogged with ignorance to us today, it was, for them, a compass. It guided them through plague and poverty, through childbirth and confession, through a life that was often short, brutal, and cold. Yet even as that worldview held tight, something new was beginning to stir. Slowly, painfully, the pieces were falling into place. The need for clean water, the understanding of contagion, the basic dignity of washing the body. The era of sacred dirt was reaching its end. And from the depths of medieval darkness, a new dawn of hygiene was preparing to rise, not with incense and prayer, but with running water, boiling linen, and soap that didn't burn the skin. A revolution was coming, one bath at a time,